Greetings, everyone. Today, we hear about the temptations of Jesus. This gospel invites us to reflect on temptations we experience and how these temptations impact our spiritual growth. Are you ready? Welcome to my podcast, A Psychologist Looks at Scripture. I am Peter Doherty, a Catholic priest and a psychologist, drawing from my background in psychology and scripture studies. I aim to provide unique insights into the Gospels and innovative pastoral teachings for Christians. The Gospels offer us a rich reservoir of knowledge about God and the development of our own spirituality. There's always more to uncover. Each episode of my podcast typically lasts between 7 to 10 minutes, during which I share reflections and insights that I hope will be beneficial to you. I welcome your questions and comments. Your feedback is always invaluable. Today's podcast focuses on Luke chapter 4, verse 1 to 13. Which this gospel will be read in churches on March the 9th, 2025. As I mentioned earlier, today's gospel focuses on the three temptations that Jesus experienced. It appears that these temptations occurred at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. He was returning from the desert after spending 40 days in the wilderness. We don't know for sure what Jesus actually did while he was in the desert. In biblical times, going to the desert had significant spiritual, symbolic, and practical meanings. Here are some of the key aspects of its significance. The desert was often a place where individuals were prepared for their destinies. The desert offered solitude, which was conducive to reflection and prayer. John the Baptist, like so many others, used this solitude to prepare for his ministry. This period allowed for spiritual growth and purification. The desert environment was harsh, and so fostered a sense of dependence on God, emphasizing humility as a prerequisite for spiritual understanding. The desert provided a setting for direct communication with God, free from distractions. We have many examples of Jesus going to a deserted place to pray. This is evident in the stories of Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, who all had significant encounters with God in the desert. The Israelites faced numerous challenges during their 40-year journey. This symbolism highlighted the desert as a proving ground for faith. Despite its harsh conditions, the desert was a place where God demonstrated his provision and faithfulness. The Israelites received manna and quail, illustrating God's care for his people, especially in the time of hardship. In summary, the desert in biblical times was a place of spiritual transformation, symbolic testing, and practical demonstration of God's presence and provision. Likely, Jesus spent his time in prayer and reflecting on his ministry. I wonder when Jesus knew he was God's Son, the Messiah. He likely had some idea that he had a special relationship with God, but he probably needed time to reflect on these issues and grow in understanding and discern how he would respond to the will of God in his life. Luke says that he was in the desert and fasted for 40 days. Most scripture scholars suggest that Luke is making a symbolic connection between Jesus and the Israelites who spent 40 years in the desert. The point is that Luke is making sure that we know that Jesus is hungry. No one could blame Jesus for wanting to turn the stones into bread and thus ease his hunger. Jesus is being tempted to use his powers for his own needs. Jesus is not taking the bait. He would be sending the wrong message if he used his power to avoid the experience of being hungry. The second temptation is when he's shown all the kingdoms of the world. It must have been tempting for Jesus to give in to this temptation, and yet he doesn't. One cannot blame Jesus for wanting to jump ahead of the queue. Instead of spending 3 years in the desert sun, he could have his life's work done in an instant. It makes sense to evaluate the success of our projects when they are completed. It appears here that the process of growing in our spiritual lives is also a value unto itself. It makes sense to focus on the product of our work, but it seems that Jesus also recognized that the process means much too. When we are evaluating the successes and failures of our lives, we will get a much fuller and richer picture if we look at and value the steps we took to achieve our goals. The third temptation occurs when Jesus is being tempted to prove that he is the Son of God. You notice the devil begins his temptations with the phrase, "If you are the Son of God." There might have been times when Jesus doubted himself. He was also human. There would have been times where he doubted himself and wondered. These doubts could have led Jesus to give up and give in to the temptation. Having periods of doubt can create problems, yet can also ironically be beneficial to our faith development. I suspect that most adults will have periods of doubts. Doubts can be times that lead us into further self-reflection. It is by wrestling with our doubts that we can grow in our spirituality. Sadly, doubts can also lead us to justifying doing nothing and letting our faith stagnate. The choice is always ours. This passage of Scripture points out that being tempted is not sinful in itself. We can pray not to be led into temptation. Jesus was strong enough to resist these temptations and remain faithful to what he believed. Knowing what tempts you is important for your spiritual development. Temptations often arise from what is missing in our lives. Temptations often arise from a decision to take the shortcut or bypass a process or avoid our responsibilities. Temptations can also arise out of our fears. We can deal with our temptations by minimizing their impact on our lives. In some cases, we can lessen our guilt by blaming others for our temptations. We can choose not to care and make any attempt to do anything about it. On the other hand, some people become so absorbed focusing on sin, including their own. The worst case scenario are people who have become so scrupulous they critically analyze everything they do. Scrupulosity is anxiety and fear-based. It's very similar to OCD, also known as obsessive compulsive disorder. Such individuals are very hard on themselves. They miss the goodness in their lives and the goodness in God. There is a continuum with scrupulous people on one side and others who see nothing wrong in giving in to their temptations on the other side. Someone who is interested in developing their spirituality needs a healthy understanding of sin in their life, but not to be defined by it. You may find that as your spirituality grows, your sensitivity to sin may also sharpen. Hopefully, you will develop a gentle awareness of your weaknesses and actively strive to do better. The opposite could be true. Individuals who are not interested in developing their spirituality may lose or fail to develop their awareness of sin. For example, several years ago, I was approached by a person who told me they had not sinned in 3 years. Initially, I was impressed, thinking I was in the presence of a very holy person. The person went on, however, and said, "I haven't murdered anyone, I haven't defrauded or cheated anyone." Then I thought, what did they do 3 years ago? Finding that balance by becoming aware of moments in our lives where we need to do better and not be so distracted that we miss them altogether. It's often in the simple acts we do for each other that count the most, where we make choices regarding how to act. We heard last week's advice on how to treat our enemies. Today's gospel reminds us the simple acts of kindness are important. Avoiding sin is an important part of living a good moral life. Our faith life, however, should not be based upon avoiding sin, but rather spirituality grows as a result of the positive choices we make. Thank you for listening. Join me next week as we delve into another passage from Luke, where Jesus experiences what is known as the Transfiguration. This miraculous event has puzzled biblical scholars for centuries. We are invited into the spiritual world of Jesus. If this is your first time tuning in, I encourage you to explore previous episodes available on various podcast platforms and YouTube itself. New episodes are released every Sunday, focusing on the upcoming week's gospel. Your feedback is invaluable for enhancing this podcast. I would also like to express my gratitude to my team members, Heather Patel-Doherty and Ritu Coulomb, whose contributions are essential in preparing this podcast. For any questions or concerns, please reach out via email at peter.doherty, DOHERTYOMI @gmail.com. God bless you and have a blessed week.